Kinamon is the unit spam board control value turbo deck that fell off immediately on release due to how insane the power creep thrown out by the big three red decks were, losing out to Zoro, Trafalgar Law, and Whitebeard. I, however, never stopped coping and developing fire for this deck. Kinamon at its core is a surprisingly tough deck to play, with a ton of weaknesses and pitfalls that need to be accounted for. To break down the deck, we can divide it into 3 stages of gameplay. Early board control, with units like Okiku and 4-drop Yamato, creating a value spiral with units like Raizo, 5-drop Yamato, and Trafalgar Law, and lastly forcing powerful blowout units onto the board, such as Kozuki Odin, Don Quixote Rosinante, and Don Quixote do Flamingo. Doing this, you remove an opponent's early game entirely, and quickly spiral into hands large enough to make pre-ban list Whitebeard jealous. Of course, this strategy is entirely dependent on being ahead during this early game, so let's start this profile explaining how to do that. We want to go second. Raizo and Okiku are 3-drops. With our leader ability, we can turn these into turn 1 plays. That's a 2 for 5. Better than non-effect character stats. So, of course, our ideal play is to go second and play Okiku turn 1. Okiku disables an opponent from playing any 5-cost or lower unit, effectively removing an opponent's first 3 turns from mattering. They can't play early blockers, and more than that, they can't even try to play anything unless it has 5k or more stats. You should then follow up this Okiku with a 5-drop Yamato. And if you can do this, you're really set to win the game from here. Unfortunately, even with mulligans, the odds of opening Okiku are only around 64%, and the odds of going second are, of course, 50%. So, what do we do in these other positions? Going first, Okiku turn 2 is still fine, and then you could go into a 4-cost Yamato, turn 3, to get a full rest of the opponent's board. It's not as good as that turn 1 Okiku, but it's not hopeless either. Going first requires more forward planning. For example, if you have a Trafalgar Law, throw a 1-drop out turn 1. That way you can get an additional play and a blocker. Since you're playing a Trafalgar Law, you won't have to worry about trying to resolve Kinamon skill. It's these little bits of thinking ahead that you really have to be conscious of when playing this deck. And another example, if you have to rely on resting units, calculate what an opponent will remove so you can have at least one on board to trigger Kinamon skill for one of our Yamatos. So with this in mind, establishing board control is key to playing the deck. Every other deck is just better than you if left alone. So, you gotta abuse the powerful rest effects early to enable your blowouts later. If you're playing these units with Kinamon skill, they will just be higher attack than anything your opponent can throw out. Most opponents will not be ready to play around this. You can use this lead you've generated to then go into the second stage of this deck. Once we have the basics of board control, we can move on to the value spiral. First and foremost, this involves attempting to establish the Yamato double swing banish. You win the game 100% of the time Yamato swing hits. Against any matchup, removing 2 cards from the opponent's hand and extra trigger effects is too much a swing in value to compensate for, especially against decks like Queen, Yellow, and Blue, which do have crazy triggers. It is always advisable to rest blockers through any means necessary and then put at least 4 Dawn on Yamato swing to force an opponent to take the hit. Either it eats their hand, or obliterates life as a resource. Most players don't fear Yamato swing as much as they should. A good player will use any removal possible to get rid of it, establish enough blockers, or leave up an event to stop it. Of course, a lot of players right now do not have the matchup experience versus Kinamon, and will underestimate this, letting you do a 4 or more Dawn on the swing. It is worth it to skip your turn, put the Dawn on it, go face. Alongside Yamato, we can also spam Raizo and Momosuke for value. Raizo is a free draw, and is a secondary play if we don't see Okiku. If we have to play him first turn, we can still resolve his draw effect by playing Momosuke to trigger the rested unit requirement. Oh yeah, because this card is poorly worded, I should clarify that Raizo does in fact count himself for the cost of this skill. Raizo also combos with Okiku by simply being a swing into whatever we rest with the ability. If he swings into low attack stuff, we don't even have to put Dawn on him to hit. The best way to set up Raizo is by comboing it with Trafalgar Law. Law can either play a unit for free by bouncing an earlier played 1 cost, or Law can reset a 3 cost we don't want an opponent to attack into. An important distinction to this deck is that we are sometimes okay with risking Momosuke on the field. It's really fine, as 37% of your search targets aren't even counter. If an opponent doesn't play a cheap searcher, or we remove them early with Okiku skill, we can play Momosuke as a pseudo blocker. It's such a valuable card in the eyes of the opponent, they will commit a sizable attack to get rid of it. Doing these small loops and fighting for every bit of value possible, you'll end up massively ahead of your opponent. Not only in hand size, but also in denying your opponent key resources. they will at this point have lost board control, have lost hand advantage, and have lost valuable chances to come back with life triggers. So that begs the question, what do we do next? Once we establish value, we can move on into our top end, high-cost units that force an opponent's ultimate loss. 8-drop Kazuki Odin. 8-drop Kazuki Odin has two situations he'll come up in. First, if we trade well throughout the game and leave up a full board, we can throw out an Odin to secure our win. In this case, if an opponent wastes removal on it, it stops the rest of their plays and protects our honestly more problematic. Do assume that Odin will never be removed by KO effects. Blue will bottom deck it or return it to hand, yellow will put it into life, red, black, purple, and green will just try to race you through life. The second case to play Odin is when we need to recover or develop into early game. If an opponent does somehow manage to break through our early game, we can use Kinamon skill to play Odin for cheap. This creates a big threat that some matchups just can't handle. And even if they do, the pressure an opponent will feel to get rid of Odin completely dictates how their turn will play out. Because Odin, as an 8-drop with an on-KO effect, takes an absurd amount of resources to kill, but an opponent will still feel pressure in this, as it will be two separate, huge attacks. All in all, Odin gives you an in back into the game as another jumping off point. Rosinante is a powerful way to force your lead onto an opponent. It might seem awkward at first, but it's very powerful and surprisingly consistent enough. Rosinante plus Law lets us play 3 units from hand. This is a perfect outlet to abuse our massive hand size and value we'll get throughout the game. It lets us use skills without any negative repercussions, as it creates 3 separate targets for an opponent to deal with. And of course, if for some reason our opponent still has life, dropping Rosinante plus 5-drop Yamato is crazy good. An opponent is more than likely be able to remove one Yamato, but dropping the second one later into the game, followed by KO protection, is crazy. And as I mentioned before, it is surprisingly consistent. Without extra card draw or searching from Raizo, your odds are a base 32% for drawing both a level 5 in Rosinante. This assumes 2 damage taken, no aggressive mulliganing for it, and only the 4-turn card draws. In a more ahead position or a long grind game, where we can trigger Raizo as well as searching for Yamato, we can bump those odds to well over 60 to 70%. Rosinante is actually a consistent threat, and by designing my list to be focused around the value spiral, we can live with only running 2 of them. And if, let's say, you do really want to force it, you can mulligan for it. I don't recommend this as you want to keep Okiku, but having that up your sleeve for late game can matter a lot in some matchups. Here's a collection explaining the miscellaneous tech options we have for those edge case matchups. Don Quixote do Flamingo is a board control finisher. If for some reason we can't establish board control or start to lose it later on, we can play 10-drop Dolphy to shut down an opponent and cheese out a win anyway. In this build, I chose 10-drop Dolphy over the similar 8-drop Eustace Captain Kidd because Dolphy better handles the yellow matchup. Yellow is a matchup you will be facing, so having options to even the playing field is really important. Speaking of handling yellow, we're also running 8 1-drop blockers just in case. As you've probably noticed, there's not a lot of guard value, so we use the blockers to compensate. Use your large hand size to bluff counter value. And lastly, Punk Gibson is an additional option for resting units. It hits chump blockers and sometimes important cheap pieces. It's awkward to use, but amazing when it goes off. Plus, the trigger effect is actually insane. If you've liked this video so far, please subscribe. It helps the channel out and lets me know that y'all want more. Alright, let's do a recap of this deck's strengths and weaknesses before we finish off. For strengths, it's got insane early game board control, actual reusable draw power engines, tons of cheap blockers, and top end with protection and or defense. For weaknesses, it has little counter value, it has to get ahead early, the leader skill is kind of clunky, and the game plan as a whole is kind of vulnerable to removal. Kinamon takes a ton of skill to pilot successfully, but once you figure out the kinks, it easily becomes one of the most fun and most rewarding decks to play in One Piece. And it's why I tend to find myself recommending it to many players to pick up. If only Secret Rare Yamato wasn't so expensive. I hope y'all like this Kinamon deck profile. It's a deck I absolutely adore, and I think everyone should give it a try. If this video does well, I'll do more of these One Piece deck profiles in future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.